Wheeler Concert Hall on the campus of Casper College for the Wyoming Republican candidates debate for United States Senate. I would ask that if any of you have cell phones that you put them in some type of silent arrangement or non-audible mode so that it wouldn't distract particularly the candidates or the people that you're sitting with. As with the previous debate, all candidates have agreed to negotiated rules for the debate, and the moderator has discretion in settling timing disputes. As before, position on the stage and in the order of opening statements and questions were determined by drawing names from a hat 15 minutes ago, prior to this debate. It is my honor and privilege to introduce you from left to right, our candidates or their surrogates running for position for Wyoming's United States Senator. Position 1 is Bobbi Brown Barrasso. Position 2, Mr. Dave Dodson. Position 3, Mr. John Holtz. Position 4, Anthony Van Risseghem. And position 5, Mr. Charlie Hardy. Our candidates on the panel have recognized that John Barrasso is unable to attend tonight's debate due to duties in Washington, D.C. Most have agreed to an opening statement to be delivered on his behalf by his significant other, Bobbi Brown Barrasso. A slight variation from the previous format for governor. In this case, up to 90 seconds for each opening statement will be allowed. Only participants in tonight's debate will be allowed to participate in the debate and to provide a closing statement. In other words, Mrs. Barrasso will only be allowed to give an opening statement, and that will be the limits to her opportunities this evening. Similar to the previous event, each candidate will have 50 seconds to respond to a direct question from our panel. And then other participating candidates will be allowed up to 30 seconds to respond or to comment, and then the candidate that was asked the direct question will have an additional 30 seconds to follow up. So we will begin now with our opening statements. The first one will be Bobbi Brown Barrasso.
Thank you, Roy, and thank you to the organizers. My husband says, "Dear friends, while I want to be here tonight, my first and most important job is the one you elected me to do, to represent Wyoming in the Senate. This week, we confirmed our 24th conservative judge to the Circuit Court and passed the National Defense Authorization Act. Today, I chaired an Environment and Public Works hearing where I focused on Wyoming energy. Confirming Brett Kavanaugh to the Supreme Court is next on our agenda. I'm proud of my record fighting for Wyoming, a record that includes legislation returning hundreds of millions of dollars in abandoned mineland money to the state. I get home every weekend. Last weekend, Bobbi and I drove from end to end of our magnificent state and many places in between. I work every day to make sure Wyoming has a strong, healthy, and growing economy. We slashed punishing Obama-era regulations that hurt Wyoming energy and jobs. The results are paying off. Wyoming had the fastest wage growth in America in 2017. Under President Trump, we passed the largest tax cut in over 30 years. Now, Wyoming families can keep more of their hard-earned money. From energy to education, agriculture, and public lands to children's health, I've fought for Wyoming families and resources. We are blessed beyond measure to call Wyoming home. I am optimistic about our future. Thank you for your support. I'd appreciate your vote August 21st.
Thank you. Candidate number 2 will be Mr. Dave Dodson. Mrs. Barrasso, thank you.
Thank you. I've had a successful business career. I grew up like most of you, and I've been here a long time. That's all I'm going to say about my bio. Because the real story tonight is that our senator is missing. Now, we're going to be told that he had important business at the Senate and would very much like to be here. And he'll have an opportunity to make good on that because 3 days ago I sent him an email and asked him that we participate together on a Facebook Live event, just the two of us and you voters asking us questions. I'm waiting to hear back from him. As for the important Senate business, this morning our senator had a routine committee hearing that ended around 11 this morning. And what were these hearings about? Approving mid-level appointees to the EPA. 20 months into Trump's presidency, our Senate is still trying to staff our government. This is the type of work that Alan Simpson and Malcolm Wallop had no trouble getting done on time. And that's why the Senate is in session in August, because they can't get anything done. Now, Over the last decade, this group has turned what I consider to be a great American institution into a bit of a circus. It's a group that has become so impressed with themselves and so above us that they can't get their job done on time. And rather than do that job, they elbow their way into the next photo and insult their colleagues. I want to help change that. I want to return to competency, and I want to return to public service, and frankly, I want my Senate back.
Thank you.
And now you know why Senator Barrasso is not here and why I am.
Our next presenter, Mr. John Holtz.
Thank you. Just to give you a little bit of background, I'm a little bit, I guess there are no degrees of uniqueness, so I'm unique. I became a judge overnight in Wyoming, just a stone's throw from here in Douglas and Glen Rock. Did that 12 years. Remember doing trials here. And helped basically set up what is now the circuit court today. Before that, I worked for, my first job out of law school was for Hughes Aircraft, which was a very interesting place to work. Howard had died a little over a year before, and Hughes Aircraft, at its height, had employed about 85,000 employees. It made at one point half the geosynchronous satellites in the world, approximately, and the Tomahawk missiles that just hit Syria were once made by Hughes Aircraft. I set a record there, getting the first double-digit firm fixed-price contract in the history of the Hughes Aircraft Company. I then had a team of engineers and scientists to redesign the fire control system of the highest profile contract, the M60A3 main battle tank. Chrysler made the tank, Hughes made the laser rangefinder ballistic computer thermal imaging system. They used to kid me about, because my license plates kind of stood out, they had a horse on them and said Wyoming. But I gave that up, decided to come back to Wyoming. I've been a leader on 3 continents, from the Philippines on Clark Air Base, to Munich, Germany at the University of Maryland, to my college fraternity, Kappa Sigma at the University of Wyoming.
Time. Mr. Van Risseghem.
Thank you all for coming out here to support us and to listen to us debate about topics that you guys have chosen. I am Anthony Van Risseghem. I grew up here since '94. I am not a Wyoming native. I was born in Grand Forks, North Dakota, but Wyoming is my home. I love Wyoming. I love the beauty of the land here, and I love the values of Wyoming. And one of the things is reason why I'm fighting for to be part of the U.S. Senate is to help fight for our rights, because they are ever encroaching upon us with taking our rights away by the federal governments. And I feel that we need somebody in office that is willing to stand up in the U.S. Senate and say, no, this is wrong, it is unconstitutional, and it's a violation of our human rights. Thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Hardy, opening statement.
Good evening, and thank you for being here. Thank you for organizing this. Why is Charlie Hardy running for the U.S. Senate? It's because I am mad as hell, and I'm not going to take this anymore. I've heard that around the state of Wyoming. And why are we mad as hell? For example, we have so many people going bankrupt because they can't pay hospital bills. Dr. Barrasso hasn't done anything in these 11 years to alleviate the situation of health in Wyoming. Why are we mad? College students come out $40,000 in debt. Today's newspaper says many couples are breaking up because of their student debt. What has Senator Barrasso done about this? We have people working their butts off and they're not getting ahead. They want full-time jobs, not part-time jobs. They want jobs with benefits. They want jobs with a decent salary. The minimum wage hasn't even been raised in 9 years. Why are we angry? What about money in politics? We're buying elections rather than winning elections. Senator Barrasso has used our time to amass almost $7 million for this election, $28 for each person. A sister of mine died last year. She's got 3 letters since that time asking her to be part of his team. When does this stop? And we need peace in the world. We are involved in conflicts all around the world. The Republican Party has been good on fiscal conservatism. Okay, why do we have a national debt bigger than ever?
Thank you, Mr. Hardy. We will now begin our question and answer period. Thank you, Mr. Barrasso. We will begin with Mr. Hardy and work this way.
Mr. Hardy, how important is Medicare?
Pardon me, Bob.
Oh. Okay. Mr. Hardy, how important is Medicare to you? Does Medicare need to be fixed? What's your plan?
I believe our nation will be stronger if everyone is healthy. Other nations around the world have figured out a way to do this. We could do it also. The big problem I have with Affordable Care Act is the word affordable. I think health care is a right, and I would like to see everyone covered under some program such as Medicare. Medicare is administered much better than any private security, any private insurance company is able to do in our United States.
Mr. Van Risseghem, you have 30 seconds to respond.
With Medicare, I'm actually disabled and I'm on Medicare. And I'll tell you one thing, they do not help out at all with our rising healthcare costs. When I've had a $130,000 in surgery last year, and the hospitals have to eat $111,000 of that, that's where our increases in costs are. It's unfair to the private sector, and it's unfair to us Americans because we pay for it all the time out of our paychecks. And even when you're on disability or Social Security, you're having increases every year to it.
Thank you. Mr. Holtz.
Certainly Medicare could be improved. Today, though, I experience the VA. Since I'm the only veteran, I use it, and it's an interesting experiment in socialized medicine, and I think it's a good system. It could be improved, like Medicare could certainly be improved. But we have to look at the guy who gave us the Affordable Care Act, and as a president, he certainly was nothing to write sonnets about. So I think he left us a mess that's going to take a while to fix.
Thank you. Mr. Dodson, 30 seconds.
So I come about this from a business standpoint. The problem is not how we pay for it, it's what we pay. We're overcharged, plain and simple. And we're overcharged because the healthcare industry and the pharmaceutical industry are the biggest donors to Congress. Our senator, Senator Barrasso, receives more money from the pharmaceutical industry than 3 other senators out of 95. That's the problem. And so until we address the cost of healthcare and the money in politics, it doesn't matter whether it's Medicare or Medicaid or single payment.
Thank you. Mr. Hardy, you have 30 seconds.
Dr. Barrasso is our senator. 11 years, and we have not seen anything new, anything that helps all the people in the United States. That's the question that's before you today. Who are you going to vote for? Are you going to vote for a doctor who hasn't helped us at all with regard to our medical expenses in the state of Wyoming and in the United States?
Thank you. Our second question for the evening will be directed to Mr. Van Risseghem.
What would you do to reform immigration?
So with immigration, I have friends that are immigrants. I have an uncle that recently just immigrated here. I am for immigration that's done legally. I am against this illegal immigration, and I feel that if you're coming into this country, you should be doing it the right way. Otherwise, yes, you should be deported back to the country of origin. And we do need to build that border wall to help secure our borders, because it's not only just people coming in, it's sex trafficking, including minors, and drugs coming across that border that's unsecured. And really, certain parts of the border, it's pretty much just me going from this stage down to the audience. That's the border security.
Thank you. Mr. Holtz, 30 seconds.
I started school in Del Rio when my dad was the OSI agent, Office of Special Investigations at Laughlin Air Force Base. So I'm familiar with what it was like on the border years ago. And I've watched, when I was stationed as a lieutenant in Laredo, watching for sea-launched ballistic missiles. Things had changed a bit. They've gotten much worse since then. I think we need a system where we enforce our laws, and if we need to, we go back to the Old West and get bounty hunters for illegal aliens and enforce the law.
Mr. Dodson, you have 30 seconds.
So 30 seconds isn't enough time to lay out my immigration policy, but I did lay it out on my website for very specific points, including all the way down to the level of fines I would charge employers who hire illegal aliens. That is the difference between me and most of the other senators. I have a specific immigration plan. I'd like the opportunity to implement it on behalf of America because our southern border is an embarrassment, and it's been an embarrassment for 40 years under both Democrats and Republicans.
Thank you. Mr. Hardy, 30 seconds.
Active clergyman for 29 years, and so the words of Jesus haunt me. I was a stranger, and you did not take me in. As long as you've done this to the least of my brethren, you've done it to me. I'll stop with that.
Thank you. Mr. Van Risseghem, you have 30 seconds to respond.
Going along with Dave Dodson, having fines for these companies that repeatedly hire illegal immigrants and possibly to the point of shutting them down is a strong possibility to help control the illegal immigration problem here in the U.S. Thank you.
Thank you. Our third question for the evening will be directed to Mr. Holtz.
Mr. Holtz, how will you engage productively in Washington given the partisan landscape that currently exists?
Well, I think I'd get a few cloves of garlic, chomp on them, and get in the Democrat's face and argue like hell. You want to get things done, you're going to have to be tough, and you're going to have to learn vampire politics where you don't just kill a program, you drive a stake through its heart so it doesn't come back to life.
Thank you.
Wow,
Mr. Dodson.
You only need to look at his Twitter account to see where John Barrasso stands on partisanship. Look, if you want to go there to raise money and be on cable TV, partisanship works. If you want to go there to get things done, partisanship is exactly the wrong thing. I want to go there to get things done. My instincts as a business person is you have to work with the other side to get things done. So partisanship is not a temptation to me because I'm going there for a different reason. I'm going there to get things done for the people of Wyoming and the people of America. Thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Hardy, you have 30 seconds.
When I was in high school, I was on a debate team. My partner's family were Republicans, my folks were Democrats. We won every debate our last year because we worked together. I've done that my whole lifetime, and that's what has to happen in Washington today, working together, Democrats or Republicans. There's good people on both sides.
Thank you. Mr. Van Risseghem, 30 seconds.
Pretty much what we need to do is start working what's for the greater good for American and the American people. Right now, it's more of just pay me, pay this, or let's attack this person, let's attack that person. That is not getting stuff done. That is creating a greater divide in this country, and we need to stop it.
Thank you. Mr. Holtz, you have 30 seconds to respond.
We need to get tough, and we need to get things done, and we need to send people there that aren't concerned with feathering their own nest and enhancing their career and are willing to risk their career like I did when I was a judge. And I'd be in arguments with other judges or the Supreme Court doing the right thing, and it's getting tougher and tougher. We see a real growth in anti-Christian bigotry, and it needs to stop.
Thank you. Our fourth question for the evening will be directed to Mr. Dodson.
With respect to the questions surrounding Russia. What is a senator's role with respect to the questions surrounding Russia?
Honestly, it's part of the circus, really. I'm not going there to participate in what I've observed in Washington, D.C., which is it's more fun to talk about Russia and more fun to talk about what Donald Trump did as a private citizen than it is addressing a healthcare costs, addressing an infrastructure plan, fixing a border that's an embarrassment, and simplifying our tax code. I've seen nothing that would make me think that President Trump shouldn't be in office. There's obviously things that our government needs to do to secure our elections. That's sacred to us. But beyond that, I'm not going there to participate in this circus. I'm going there to get things done for Wyoming voters as well as America.
Thank you. Mr. Hardy, you have 30 seconds.
I'm in favor of us having better relationships with Russia and North Korea and with every country in the world. I do not think we should alienate our allies, and I also don't think we should be involved in regime change. President Trump said, "We will stop racing to topple foreign regimes that we know nothing about. This destructive cycle of intervention and chaos must finally come to an end." I'm all in favor of that. I wish we would stop trying to tumble regimes.
Thank you. Mr. Van Risseghem, you have 30 seconds.
All right, so this whole thing with Russia, it's pretty much like Dodson said, a circus act. It's the Democrats blowing smoke in the air and trying to devalue our president. I would sit there and go and tell them either provide the proof and start indictment processes now or close it and be done with it. No more wasting our taxpayers' money.
Thank you. Our fifth question for the evening will be directed to Mr. Hardy. Mr. Dodson. Mr. Holtz, I'm so sorry. You have 30 seconds.
In all seriousness, I'd be tough on Russia. Our family friend from Del Rio, Rudolph Major Anderson, was the only casualty in the Cold War. He was shot down in the Bay of Pigs in a U-2 by a Russian missile. I babysat his kids. It's personal with me. I would hold Russia's nose to the grindstone, and I wouldn't give an inch.
Thank you. Mr. Dodson, you have 30 seconds.
Yeah, and as it pertains to how we behave among ourselves, there used to be a time with Americans where if you crossed one of us, you crossed all of us. And we're in a situation now where this is Democrat versus Republican. That's not my value. Russia crossed us. I don't care whether they crossed a Republican or a Democrat. We should be arm in arm, shoulder to shoulder as Americans.
Thank you, and my regrets. The fifth question for this evening will be directed to Mr. Hardy.
Describe your understanding of the Senate's role in congressional oversight of the administrative branch, and describe how what you would have done to perform that role during the past 18 months.
I really think too much has been done, whether in the Obama administration or in the current one, executive decisions along the way. Congress has got to be involved, and I just don't see that happening. I don't see any action, practically speaking, coming out of the Senate or out of Congress. It's all coming from the president, see. And that's not the way our government was set up.
Thank you. Mr. Van Risseghem?
So, pretty much, our role is part of the checks and balances. And we need to reinvert that to the president saying, A, you don't have a limited power. Secondly, we need to actually start working with the judicial system and the administrative branches to get things done for the American people.
Thank you. Mr. Holtz?
Yeah, I'm quite concerned because to get things done, it seems like you have to change the rules. And that doesn't work for very long. We saw that with the confirmation of federal appellate judges. We saw it recently with the death of Justice Scalia. And we don't know what we're going to see coming up here, but keep changing the rules is not the answer you really want to use forever. You have to do something else.
Thank you. Mr. Dodson?
Yeah, 3 branches of government, separate but equal. The problem is our legislative branch isn't doing their job, and so starting about a decade ago, the president started writing laws. That needs to end. Also, we need to have a legislative branch that does the hard work of writing laws. It's not as much fun as oversight. It's not as much fun as criticizing the other branches of government, but it is what we pay them $174,000 a year to do.
Thank you. Mr. Hardy, you have 30 seconds.
It's nice to have a bit of time to think about things. The Republicans getting together by themselves, Democrats getting together by themselves, that's not the way it's got to go. It's not the way. We've got to work with each other. My whole life, I have tried to do that, be amongst people and accept people. And from there, you can go a long, long way.
Thank you. Our next question, number 6, will be directed to Mr. Van Risseghem.
Are you in favor of private control of public lands in Wyoming and the West, and why?
All right, so from what I'm getting about this question is getting rid of all the federal and state use lands. Pretty much, I am for the state having control of the lands that the federal government has. I am for private ownership of lands, but yet we still need to make sure to set aside lands for wildlife and for us to hunt, fish outdoors. I hunt and I go fishing, and we also need to do it fiscally responsible and environmentally responsible too. And one thing that the U.S. government has been failing is properly managing our federal lands, hence why you're seeing all these out-of-control forest fires.
Thank you. Mr. Holtz, you have 30.
I'm in favor of private ownership, obviously, but you have to have either the state or federal government own and manage large chunks of Wyoming. I prefer it in state hands. I think government is best that governs least and is closest to the people. Nothing is perfect, but I think it would be better in the state. That's my opinion. Thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Dodson, 30 seconds.
My answer to your question is absolutely not. That land is for my great-great-great-grandkids. We're custodians of that land. We need to take care of it. We're here in Wyoming because we love our open space. We're all outdoorsmen, or most of them are outdoorsmen, and this is an area where Senator Barrasso and I could not be further apart.
Thank you. Mr. Hardy?
Republican gathering, I think we should take a moment and honor Teddy Roosevelt, who fought for lands out here that could be used by all the people of our country, and definitely I am against state taking control of federal lands.
Thank you. Finally, Mr. Van Risseghem, 30 seconds.
I'm fine, thank you.
All right. Our next question, number 7, will be directed to Mr. Holtz.
Mr. Holtz, the tax cuts, of course, are a reality. How would you make up the revenue needed now to fund government?
Well, I think part of the things we could do is enforce our immigration laws. I don't think letting illegal aliens participate in Social Security is such a red-hot idea. A few years ago, Senator Barrasso pulled a Halloween trick and cost everyone in this room that was born after 1954 about 50 grand by changing the rules. Senator Enzi voted against it. Obama signed it. It had to do with file and suspend, restricted file, various things in the Social Security Code. Social Security needs to be fixed, but it needs to be fixed with given some thought and some time to plan effectively. But there are a number of things that we can do, but it's going to take cooperation, which so far doesn't seem to exist in Washington, D.C.
Thank you. Mr. Dodson?
Yeah, it's the single biggest issue facing this country, and we should be very concerned about it. We were promised that those tax cuts would be paid for with spending cuts. 5 months later, we passed the second biggest spending bill in U.S. history, 6 months late, at midnight, unread. That's not good governance. That's not my Republican Party. What we need is we need to get senators in there who will make the hard decisions to preserve our fiscal security so that our children have the same future that my parents provided for me.
Thank you. Mr. Hardy?
I like to say I'm an Eisenhower Republican, and President Eisenhower warned us against the military-industrial complex. At the present moment, we spend more money on our military budget than the next 8 countries together, Russia, China, Saudi Arabia, and so on. I'm all for our military, I'm all for our veterans, but this whole thing of the military-industrial complex is a place where we've got to look at the money that's being spent there, and it's not helping the ordinary serviceman or servicewomen.
Thank you. Mr. Van Risseghem?
It's not about increasing our revenues. It's about actually sitting there and going through and having each department cut their spending and wasteful spendings. How many of you have been to a federal office and see 80% of the space to help you guys vacant, not being used, but yet filled with equipment? Those are wasteful spendings that we need to stop doing, and those are revenue cuts that we can actually make.
Thank you. Mr. Holtz, you have 30 seconds.
We need to make drastic cuts. Our true fiscal gap, everything going in and everything coming out, as near as we can tell, is probably close to 300 trillion. If we don't do something soon, and I mentioned vampire politics where you kill programs, they don't come back to life, we're going to be like Venezuela or the Weimar Republic in Germany, where a father gave his son a year's tuition to go to school in Munich. The next day it wouldn't pay for streetcar fare.
Thank you. Our next question, number 8, will be directed to Mr. Dodson.
Are you concerned that we're trending away from NATO? And if so, what would you do about it?
Well, no, I don't think we're trending away from NATO. I think our president is negotiating with our partners, and I think he has every right to do that. And we'll have to wait and see what the outcome is. But we have this feeling that we cannot offend any of our friends in the process of negotiating. And this is an area where President Trump and I have a lot in common, which is that I understand when you're negotiating, sometimes it gets a little bit rough and sometimes it gets a little bit unpleasant, but in the end, you find a solution that works for all parties, you shake hands and you move forward. Now, some of our partners have not been doing their fair share. President Trump rightfully has pointed that out, and he's revisiting a very old agreement, and I support that, and we need to wait and see how he comes out on it. But meanwhile, I support it.
Thank you. Mr. Hardy, 30 seconds.
And going back to what I mentioned before, I mean, yes, we need NATO, but also those countries have to pay their fair share. And what I mentioned, we are spending way too much on the military-industrial complex, and that money could be used building roads and other things here within the United States, even in the area of healthcare, education, and so on. So yes, stay with NATO, but let's confront them as far as what costs go.
Thank you. Mr. Van Risseghem.
As pretty much all of us are saying, NATO, all the other people in the NATO treaties need to start paying their fair share. It's really bad when Greece, which is pretty much a bankrupt country, is actually paying more than what Germany is paying. And yes, we need to go back and start reevaluating these agreements that are decades old and start going, we need to renegotiate these. And if you can't renegotiate, then we need to terminate the agreements.
Thank you. Mr. Holtz, 30 seconds.
My college nickname at the University of Wyoming was Herr Holtz, which means Mr. Holtz in German. The reason, because my father was Deputy Inspector General of Security for United States Air Force Europe in Wiesbaden, Germany. NATO is important. You do not want to weaken NATO. We have seen in the past what happens. I got to see it firsthand when I was in August of 1968 when I had to cancel a trip to Prague because the Russians decided to take a tour, unannounced. Things happen quickly, and you have to be ready.
Thank you, Mr. Holtz. Finally, Mr. Dodson, 30 seconds.
I think I'm fine.
Question number 9 will be directed to Mr. Hardy.
Mr. Hardy, what can be done to either tweak the Affordable Care Act or what can you do to reduce health insurance prices?
Again, I think am I coming through okay? Is the sound on? Okay. Our nation will be stronger if everyone is healthy. As I mentioned, the problem I have with the Affordable Care Act is that word affordable. It makes health care a commodity. I think it's a right. We will be stronger if everyone here is healthy. Other nations have found ways to take care of all their people. We've got to do the same thing. It's not a matter of tweaking it. It's a matter of coming up with a health program that will address the needs of all the people of our country.
Thank you. Mr. Van Risseghem.
So, Affordable Care Act, or Obamacare, is one of the biggest shams in our recent history. It's not affordable, it increases our costs, it's making us unable to actually go see doctors with these outrageous deductibles, and we need to scrap it. We need to start removing a lot of these regulations that are increasing your health care costs.
Thank you. Mr. Holtz.
We are in serious trouble. I think it should be left to the states, but we have serious problems with states. We have states that are running out of money. And guess what, folks? They can't print money and they can't go bankrupt. So where are they going to turn? Probably to the federal government. And I'm talking about New York, California, Colorado's not that far behind. We have a number of serious problems that need to be addressed, but it should be addressed by the states with federal assistance.
Thank you. Mr. Dodson?
President Trump wanted to fix Obamacare. Our senator had no plan when he asked for a fix. Even though our senator complained for 7.5 years, we are charged too much, and the healthcare industry is protected by Congress. That is why we have people in this state who are uninsured or cannot afford enough insurance to cover their deductibles, that they are choosing between their rent and health insurance. That's not a value that I share. I want to take a wrecking ball to that industry and those anti-competitive practices and lower our healthcare costs. And it's in my plan, 11 specific things I'll do.
Thank you. Mr. Hardy, 30 seconds to respond.
I'll go back to my original statement. I'm mad as hell, and I'm not going to take this anymore. The person that question should have been addressed to was Senator Barrasso. He's a doctor. What has he done to see that we do have Affordable Care Act, that we have hospitalization, that we have care for people and their health in the United States? He's the one who should be here today answering that question.
Thank you. Our question number 10 will be directed to Mr. Van Risseghem.
What do you think about efforts to renegotiate trade agreements, and how do you think these efforts will help or hurt America?
All right, so we are pretty much losing money in trade. We are trying to do this whole free trade agreement with all of our allies, but yet they're charging tariffs on us. So yes, we are going back and saying, all right, if you want to do those tariffs, we'll level the playing field and charge you the same type of tariffs. If we want us to be competitive in the world market, we need to make sure that our allies and us are on a level playing field. If not, we'll move up to their standards. And if they want to negotiate and come down to our standards, that's great, but we need to make it a level playing field if we want to be competitive in the world economy.
Thank you. Mr. Holtz?
Well, looking at it from a Wyoming point of view, I'd like to see Wyoming coal not go to China, who's not our friend, and send it to Italy, Israel, send it to the Straits of Gibraltar, where you don't have to mess around with Somali pirates. Israel right now gets most of its coal from South Africa, Australia, some from Colombia, and a lot of times it's got to go through and mess with the Somali pirates. And if we go through the Straits of Gibraltar, we could do that. We could take it out of Houston, ship it down from Wyoming on a train, and ship valuable energy to Israel and Italy.
Thank you. Mr. Dodson, 30 seconds.
Yeah, I mean, probably no surprise. This is a place where President Trump and I have something in common. We're both business people. He's negotiating old trade agreements. They're not sacred. There's nothing wrong with renegotiating those trade agreements. I also really like the way he is subsidizing industries that are being particularly damaged during the negotiation, which gives him more leverage. We need to give him a chance, as we have decided in 1934 that the president has the right to negotiate those trade agreements, to do it and see where they come out. I think he needs the right to negotiate.
Thank you. Mr. Hardy?
And I'm not against tariffs, but I disagree, Dave. The fact that soybean producers can't sell the product, and so we're going to subsidize them. And so, I mean, they could have brought in money for that instead, taking taxpayer money to give them for crops that they're not able to sell. That doesn't make a lot of sense. I'm just afraid too much of this is being done off the cuff without a lot of foresight and thinking going into it. But I'm not against tariffs in itself.
Mr. Van Risseghem, 30 seconds to respond.
For us, subsidizing is a great thing, at least for the short term and stuff, to let the farmers and the producers of crops that cannot sell it this year change their tactics for the future years and have a year-to-year basis. Granted, we're opening up for hemp, if I read it right in our legislation, so that's a other cash crop that they can use to do instead of soy and produce other crops.
Our next question will be directed to Mr. Holtz.
Mr. Holtz, we were just talking about trade agreements just shifting directly to tariffs. Do you agree with them? Will they help or hurt America?
It's a difficult question to answer. It could be both. I'm not sure they're mutually exclusive. We could have some tariffs help, some tariffs hurt. It would depend on the amount, the country, but I think it's an exercise in futility to try and deal with our enemies. I think China, Russia, they are not our friends. You have to make some difficult decisions in politics, but I think we should, going back to NATO, support our friends, do the best you can, help them with their problems, and not aid China with Wyoming coal.
Thank you. Mr. Dodson.
Yeah, so my first degree was in economics, and this is a subject that I understand quite a bit about. 30% of our goods prior to these recent negotiations were covered in tariffs, so tariffs are nothing new to us. What we're doing is we're revisiting some very old agreements and trying to improve upon them. We do need tariffs in some cases to level the playing field, and that's a reasonable thing for us to be doing, and that's a reasonable thing for us to be asking of our trading partners.
Thank you. Mr. Hardy?
Could I ask you to repeat the question?
What do you think about tariffs? Will they help or hurt America?
Well, it depends. I mean, they could help, they could hurt. It depends on how they're applied, to what products and so on. You know, when I was in high school, we debated free trade. I don't remember what we came up with, but we saw there were two sides to the question, and I guess that's where I am. Some could help, some could hurt. Sorry.
Thank you. Mr. Van Risseghem.
So tariffs can be a double-edged sword. Some can hurt us, some can help us. But the big thing is we need to renegotiate our trade agreements. And if getting them to the negotiation table is by implementing tariffs that they are putting up against us on the same products, then it's a method that will help the American people in the long run.
Mr. Holtz, 30 seconds to respond.
Yes, some countries can produce things quite cheaply and take advantage of the United States. I think there needs to be a level playing field. It's difficult, and the rules change, and it's something you have to monitor carefully. But it is something in America's interest to try and make the best deals that you can and not just walk away from something when you have, for example, we have products that we need to, in our tech industry, rare earths, that are difficult and becoming increasingly more difficult to obtain from anywhere.
Thank you. Our next question will be directed to Mr. Dodson.
There are a lot of people who support reforming the Endangered Species Act. What would you do?
Yeah, it's not perfect, but again, this is an area where Senator Barrasso and I disagree. Nobody wants animals to become extinct or species to become extinct. The trick is they don't know where the state lines are. So the idea of having 50 different Endangered Species Acts is insane to me. At the same time, our local communities and states oftentimes do understand more about migratory patterns, the effect of a dirt road, and we need to be taking that into consideration better than we have in the past. But this idea of thinking that we should have 50 different policies for grizzly bears or 50 different policies for bald eagles is insane.
Mr. Hardy, 30 seconds.
I think Dave expressed that very, very well. I agree with him.
Personally,
Mr. Van Risseghem.
Personally, the big thing is with these Endangered Species Acts, they hurt us too. And yes, it is important protecting them, but yet we need to restructure them, having a flat set of rules and none of these complicated, well, you're in this section, blah, 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 so you need to do this. But yet we still need to have that responsibility of protecting the endangered species and help get them to being a vibrant species again.
Thank you. Mr. Holtz?
Well, you know, I don't just agree with Democrats, but I really don't think we need an endangered species. I think there's enough of them. I think they'll probably continue to survive. So I think it's probably unneeded.
Mr. Dodson, 30.
I think I'm good.
Our next question will be directed to Mr. Hardy.
Mr. Hardy, what changes, if any, would you make to protect the Social Security system in the future?
Again, looking back, Republican values, how proud the Republican Party was in 1956 about strengthening the Social Security program. that a million more people were included and so on. Should the age be raised a little bit? Possibly that might be one thing that should be considered. But it is certainly not something that we should do away with. How many people here tonight are benefiting because of the Social Security system? So basically it should be strengthened.
Mr. Van Risseghem.
So the big thing is A, we need to stop taking money out of the Social Security fund without it being pertaining to Social Security. Secondly, I feel that it would be better managed if each individual accounts are properly being able to be managed by the person themselves and set up as like a 401k or a investment type of account. That money is yours because you are putting it in. And it's not the federal government's, and it's not somebody else's.
Thank you. Mr. Holtz, 30 seconds.
I think one of the greatest dangers is hyperinflation. Social Security certainly needs to be fixed. As I mentioned before, illegal aliens shouldn't be in the program. Certainly you might have to do some tweaking, and it's going to be painful, but you want to set out the rules, you want to set them out well in advance so people can plan and prepare for them. But you don't want to see $1 turn into a few pennies when you go to the store overnight.
Mr. Dodson.
The fuse is short, and the spark hits the bomb in 17 years. Anyone under the age of 51 will not get their Social Security benefits, plain and simple. The math is clear. And we have a Senate that is passing tax cuts and spending plans without addressing this. This is a serious issue. We have never in the history of America reneged on our commitment to our seniors in their retirement, and we are about to do that. We need senators to have the courage to talk about it. I have a 7-point plan on how to save Social Security, which is based on the Simpson-Bowles report.
Thank you. Mr. Holtz, you have 30 seconds.
It's nice to have a second chance to say something. We should remove the cap on paying for Social Security. If those with high incomes would continue to pay Social Security, we could take care of the system and it will survive.
Our next question will be directed to Mr. Van Risseghem.
Should social media be regulated? And if so, why? I mean, do that.
All right, so this is a very delicate question because social media is usually owned by private companies. So you don't want to infringe on the private company's rights on regulation. But yet, if that social media is now being declared like Twitter as a public forum, then they need to start adhering to the regulations of it where you're not being blocked because of something that you put on social media and stuff, because that's your freedom of speech there. If the companies want to sit there and say, well, we're not going to allow you to say this and that, then they need to step out of the political light entirely and pull away from and stop allowing political campaigns and stuff being ran through them, too.
Thank you. Mr. Holtz?
It's a difficult question. I returned recently from a memorial service in Mountain View, California, where I saw the Google car driving without a driver, and my cousin who lives there, where my grandmother also used to live, told me all his neighbors now work for Google. The problem you have is we're having news that's legitimate be censored, and that's never good in a free society. So it may take some government regulation, which I hate to see, just to level the playing field.
Thank you. Mr. Dodson?
I'm 57, so my daughter's over there. I feel like I'm looking at them going, what do I say? I'm not a social media expert, but I can just tell you my common sense view on this is that the owner agreements on things like Facebook are pages and pages and pages long. I don't think you need regulation, but I do think you need transparency. And I think people who are on Facebook or Instagram or Twitter ought to at least know the rules, and the rules shouldn't be buried in the fine print. So that's about as far as I would go. How'd I do? Okay.
Thank you. Mr. Hardy?
Yes, this thing of censorship is not something I like or I'm in agreement with. But I do think people should be held responsible for what they put on, that we should be able to know who is the person who is saying this particular thing.
Thank you. Our next question will be directed to Mr. Holtz.
Rebuttal.
Pardon me, you do. Mr. Van Risseghem. After that, we'll direct the next question to Mr. Holtz.
So, what do you think about social media? Well, and I'm trying to run through my campaign through Facebook and stuff, and I've been blocked by paying out these political ads because I don't meet their political guidelines and stuff. And this is where I say if a space like Facebook and Twitter wants to be a privately owned company, they either need to A, do a blanket statement up saying, all right, you're allowed to post anything you want, or A, need to say, we're done doing these campaign contributions and stuff and just get rid of our politics.
Thank you. Again, my regrets. The next question will be directed to Mr. Holtz.
You commit to regular town hall meetings.
Yes, I think they are useful. If they can be done safely, things are getting a bit less safe. But overall, I think with the proper security, I think it's an excellent idea. It gives the public a chance to air their grievances. I think it's good for politicians to actually see what people and hear what people think. And I think it's a great idea.
Mr. Dodson.
I respect the question, but I'm almost shocked that it's asked. Of course. You know, as a CEO, how you get your job done is you talk to your customers, you talk to your employees, you talk to your vendors, and you listen. And so I can't imagine being a senator and not have town hall meetings. Beyond that, Wendy and I have been on the campaign trail for 7 months, knocking on doors, talking to people. And I have been so enriched by that process, I can't imagine that I would give that up. If you're a senator, if you're not prepared to talk to your constituents and say, what am I doing wrong and how can I do it better, then you need a different senator.
Thank you. Mr. Hardy.
There have been town halls around the state various times during the past year. And they've been scheduled at times when Senator Barrasso would be in the state, and he's not attended any of them. Tonight he should be with us. If he is so powerful in Congress, in the Senate, then the meetings that took place today didn't have to take place today. He could have got on a plane, been here tonight, he could have been back in Washington tomorrow. Again, I'm mad as hell, I'm not going to take this anymore. Senator Barrasso should have been here tonight.
Mr. Van Risseghem.
All right, so town halls, you don't have to be up here with you guys. You can always do them remotely. If I get elected, I'll be doing weekly updates, talking about current bills in the Senate and House, going over the impacts, hearing your replies on them, and using them as a tool to hear what you guys want me to do in office and stuff, deciding what might be best for me or what I think might be best for the country.
Mr. Holtz, 30 seconds.
You know, and we can do the same thing. We could have a monitor here. We could be set up with something to DC where we could have live question and answers. With technology, we could do the same with the border wall. Physical wall is fine in places, but the Rio Grande changes a bit. And it'd be nice to have some thermal imaging and different types of technology there to actually enforce the law. So yeah, don't give up on technology, let's use it.
Thank you. Gentlemen, that's the end of our question and answer period. We'll now enter into our closing statement period. Each of you will have 90 seconds. We will start with Mr. Hardy.
The reason I got involved in politics at all is because I've spent my life trying to listen to people, accompanying them in their struggles and trying to find some solution. A lot of people are hurting. There's kids who go hungry at night here in Wyoming. I substitute teach, and you don't know what it's like on a Friday when kids are supposed to pick up some food to take home to their family, and the announcement comes over the speaker saying, we're sorry, no food came this week, don't stop for it. Or asking a kid in a lunchroom, why aren't you eating something? And he says, I didn't bring any money today. People are hurting, and I think we've got to recognize, we haven't talked about people hurting, let's say the gay community, the Native American community, the list could go on and on and on. And so, I'll go back to what I said at the very beginning. Why did I decide to run? It's because I'm mad as hell and I'm not going to take this anymore. And I don't think Senator Barrasso has done anything to help the hurting people throughout Wyoming and throughout our country.
Thank you. Mr. Van Risseghem.
Like I like to say thank you again for everybody coming out. I would like to thank everybody who's put this on and everybody who's came out here, Charlie, John, and Dave. It's been a great debate. The big thing is we need somebody in DC that is willing to stand up and fight for Wyoming, fight for our rights, and being willing to tell the other people in the Senate and the House when they try to infringe on our rights that that is unconstitutional and that is not the way of the American people. Thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Holtz.
I think we need somebody with some Wyoming background, a veteran, a graduate of the University of Wyoming. My grandmother met my grandfather in Gillette. Her brothers had the livery stable. My dad's cousin Earl was a famous pilot. He crashed. Governor Emerson of Wyoming attended his funeral. Because of that, what happened to cousin Earl? My dad couldn't be a Navy pilot. He had to enlist in the Marines. My grandfather's brother had the meat market in Worland. He was the night marshal. An old story talks about Butch Cassidy showing up saying, "That's not a very good likeness. Why don't you give me that poster?" Who knows if stuff like that's true? But Wyoming is an acquired taste, and I've acquired it. I love it, and I will make Wyoming a better place to live.
Thank you, sir. Mr. Dodson.
Sure. Wendy and I began this campaign 7 months ago on the Union Pacific Railroad, 40 degrees below zero, and we had 3 rules. Tell the truth, talk to voters directly, and give them a plan on what we would really do. Now, I'm running because we should be worried about our state. Last place economically, last place in terms of our children having to leave to find work. I worry about what that's going to do to our communities and where our 99 towns are going to be 20 years from now. And that's why I presented 10 steps to solve that. I'm also running because I worry about our democratic process. How would Thomas Jefferson and George Washington feel about a country where someone can show up to a senator with a bag full of money and buy a vote while our neighbors are choosing between rent and health care? But mostly, I worry about us. We are as far apart as we have been since the Civil War. Now, we had our problems during the 60s, but those were about issues. What we're facing now is something unique in American history because we are divided over ourselves. We were once a country that was proud, and America always exceeded our partisan identity. It was a spirit that eradicated polio and smallpox, 2 wars that saved an entire world. We built highways and dams together, and we put a footprint on the moon, and we did it as Republicans, not as Republicans or Democrats, but as Americans. And I think time is running out. We owe it to our children and the people who shed their blood for this country to come back together again, once again to do great things, and I will say as one nation under God, indivisible.
Thank you. Ladies and gentlemen, we have been very fortunate to hear from some very dedicated Wyoming citizens, good gentlemen all. We thank you all so much for your participation in tonight's debate and for what you're doing for Wyoming. Mr. Beck, Ms. Bauer, thank you very much for what you've done to make our evening very pleasurable. And audience, thank you once again for your attendance and your participation. Our political system works best when good people are involved, and we trust that this has helped you in making some good, sound decisions. Would you please welcome or help me in thanking our participants? But it's been great, and we do thank you, and I'm sure these gentlemen thank you very much for your attendance.